Hey, welcome back to the Tara Palmeri Show. Back in 2018, I was a White House correspondent for ABC News, and I remember the furious hunt I was on trying to figure out who was the administration official who penned the anonymous op-ed in the New York Times that read, "I am part of the resistance inside the Trump administration." It was all about how there was a growing resistance of administration officials, many of them appointed by the president, who were trying to stop his worst instincts. Well, that person who wrote that piece, and believe me, I got a lot of people wrong when I reached out to them about it, he is now out in the open and he's talking. His name is Miles Taylor. He was the chief of staff to the Department of Homeland Security at the time. And the president has called him a traitor. And his friends, people that he still talks to are in the administration, they have been targeted just for being friendly with him. In fact, a trade representative for the Department of Homeland Security was fired for attending his wedding back in April. So this is a really fascinating episode because Miles gives us a play-by-play of what the vibe is like inside of his old department, where he was a leader inside the Department of Homeland Security, and where there's this pressure for ICE agents to make this quota of 3,000 arrests per day. He said that there's a lot of anxiety about making mistakes during these roundups and how there could be legal repercussions. He also shares this shocking story about how President Trump pressured him to break an immigration law and offered him a pardon in exchange for doing so. Take a listen here.
I do, though, want to get to the Department of Homeland Security with you, because obviously there is so much news coming out of there with these ICE raids. Have you been in touch with anyone that works there right now? What is the mood like inside of the department with this pressure from Stephen Miller and Kristi Noem for more raids, 3,000 raids per day, 3,000 deportation?
Well, I hesitate to name anyone over there because
3,000 arrest quota. Excuse me, per day. Yeah,
they are the administration is working assiduously to identify anyone who's an associate of mine to fire them because they want to send a message that you associate with a dissenter and you're fired. And in fact, a few weeks ago, Tara, a senior trade official over at DHS, was fired because they found a photograph of him at my wedding. Not because, we conspired on an anonymous op-ed or he even shares my views of the president. This individual is a big supporter of the president. But because the White House wanted to send a message, if you are friends with critics of the president, your career is on the line. And then they went and humiliated the person by placing it as a front page story in the Washington Post and said, "We fired Anonymous's friend who was at his wedding." And so, like I said, I hesitate to say, who I'm talking to. But yeah, a lot of my friends are people who are still in the national security community, and some political appointees, some civil servants. And I think the worry over there is that a lot of the things that were prevented in the first Trump administration, especially on immigration, ideas that were not only unwise but unlawful, are now at the forefront of the department's decision making. And let me be more specific. The expansion of military deployments is something that the department fought very hard against in the first Trump administration. Is the president, down to aides like Stephen Miller and others at the White House, were very keen to use all elements of national power, especially military force, to deal with the immigration situation. The problem is there were a number of circumstances in which lawyers in the administration said, this is not legal. The way you want to do it is not legal. And now that pressure is extraordinary. We've seen the deployments in L.A., a number of folks in the department and elsewhere have grown worried that the president will urge those deployments to go to other cities. I said the same thing a few days ago, earlier this week, is that we were going to see an expansion to other cities. And of course, folks in the MAGA movement blasted me and said, that's hyperbole and there's no way and that's fake news. And then true to form, that same day, Donald Trump tweeted out that he was targeting Chicago and New York, and then in capital letters, other Democratic power centers. Make no mistake, this is a politicized effort to try to increase pressure on blue states and blue cities. And so I think, good government employees in the department are worried about DHS getting swept up in this very politicized focus on the president's domestic enemies rather than the mission. And that has a lot of very nefarious consequences. And, Tara, that for years there have been concerns that the Department of Homeland Security has insufficient safeguards for violations of civil liberties. And I will confess to be the type of individual who for years brushed those concerns off and said, come on, under what circumstance are we going to have a wayward president come into office and try to weaponize the Department of Homeland Security to go after domestic political enemies? And so, I would thumb my nose at the civil libertarians in Congress who said, DHS is dangerous, DHS is dangerous. Well, now look, I was wrong and they are right, because now we are seeing a department that's effectively unencumbered when it comes to the president's desires to go after those domestic political enemies. And he has a 250,000 person, $60 billion a year department to go carry that out if he wants to.
What's the morale like inside?
Exceptionally low. I would say there's never been lower morale at the Department of Homeland Security than there is now. But here's the strange side by side, is that's not the whole department, because especially the folks in the immigration community, you have a lot of people who really care about that mission, really want to engage in more aggressive immigration enforcement. And certainly a lot of them are delighted to see a second Trump administration and a more aggressive one. But the vast majority of the department isn't just focused on immigration. It's focused on a broader array of national security threats. And I think you have this sense throughout, the sweeping, expansive of the Department of Homeland Security, from cybersecurity to Coast Guard to counterterrorism. You have a sense that the other missions are being forgotten. The other threats to the United States are being forgotten. And largely non-threatening individuals, migrants, civilians are being prioritized as the biggest danger to the United States when they are not.
Are they afraid of what the repercussions will be if they don't reach these quotas of 3,000 arrests per day, which seem pretty high?
Yeah. Look, this was our worry at the time. When we received the same phone calls from the president and people like Stephen Miller urging us to push the envelope, the worry was that pushing the envelope means doing things that are wrong. It can mean mistakes, and it can mean compounding mistakes. Let me be more specific, picking up American citizens and accidentally deporting them to third countries and leaving them with limited legal resource to get themselves back to their families. Those are the types of very, very dangerous mistakes that can happen when you direct ICE officials to just go round them up, to go to Home Depots and supermarkets and farms and just round them up. There are safeguards in place. There are meant to be safeguards in place. And the reason why you can't just go get 3,000 people a day is because it's the responsibility of ICE officers to know the targets they're going after, know the crimes that they've committed, make sure that they identify the correct people, and that they go through legal process. And the more pressure there is from the White House to defy that, the more likely there are to be mistakes, and mistakes that set a precedent that's dangerous, not just for those migrants, but any American. Because if you violate due process, I don't care if it's someone who's just a visitor from England or someone who's lived here for 30 years, you make it easier to violate due process for other people. And that is the fear, I think, right now from folks, some folks inside the Department of Homeland Security, but also, of course, in the justice system.
So they're afraid of making mistakes and possibly being prosecuted by a future administration for making those mistakes?
Well, that too. I think that there are folks who are, people of conscience in agencies like ICE and CBP who worry that, some of these edicts coming out of the White House are going to put them in a very difficult position. Now, let me give you an example, though, of what this might turn into, because they are putting these officers in a spot where they're at risk of violating the law. In some cases, people would say that we have already seen ICE officers put into a position where they are violating the law. But Donald Trump potentially would be inclined to give these people what I would call a get-out-of-jail-free card to start testing the boundaries of the law. And that sounds like a pretty incredulous accusation, but I've been on the receiving end of it. We were in 2019 at one point. It was April 2019. We were down at the U.S. southern border, and the president wanted to do something illegal to forcibly turn back a group of migrants that were headed towards the United States. We told the president it wasn't lawful, and his response almost verbatim was, if you break the law and go to jail, I will pardon you. And almost immediately after,
free pardon the DHS officials.
Correct. I almost immediately wrote down that exact scenario and emailed it to a lawyer in the administration and said, look, I don't know if the president just broke the law by telling me I could break the law and he would pardon me to do it, but this is what happened and this is what he said. And so, I'm sure if I've witnessed one episode, I'm sure there's been dozens of episodes of the president offering pardons in exchange for illegal activity. And I think this is where that could go, because he'd already tried to do it on immigration issues before. And so as he's testing the boundaries of what he can do with the United States military, I think there's very little to prevent him from testing the boundaries of what could happen with ICE officials and pushing them to break the law, and maybe even, again, like I said, dangling pardons out there as a reason to do their jobs. Now, look, if I was an ICE official, not only would I not do that because it's wrong and it's corrupt, but I'm not sure I would trust it. I'm not sure you can trust Donald Trump to say to you, hey, I will give you a pardon if you break the law, because then he can always hang that over your head and not have yet issued the pardon. But, that's something that this man has proven a willingness to do.
Is there any concern that there's a lot of talk about how in prior administrations, like the Obama administration, they were able to really turn around migrants at the border. They were able to deport. Is there a feeling that they were doing it more effectively? That DHS was just was better at the due process, at the movement throughout the immigration courts. Although I know from having spoken to ICE lawyers and ICE judges in the past that the courts are backed up. It's a total mess inside the process. But there was a feeling that Obama was deporting people at a higher level than President Trump. Some of it was turning away people at the border. Is there a feeling that it's just such a mess inside of the DHS that removing people by all means possible as quickly as possible, and like you said, mistakes, people getting swept up, it's just not a
Yeah.
concern anymore?
Well, I'll confess to not being an immigration law expert.
Yeah.
Most of my career was national security and counterterrorism, but I have been around that scene long enough to know that, in part, the Obama administration was able to engage in more deportations because certain court decisions hadn't been made yet that make it a little bit harder and more bureaucratic to engage in deportations. But here's the real crux of it: is under U.S. law, effectively, if you want to come to the United States and claim asylum, you can reach the U.S. border and say, I am fleeing violence and persecution, and then you're put into the process. Now, that process is totally broken on both ends. It's broken on the government end, and it does a total disservice to people who are actually fleeing violence and persecution. Why? Because it can take anywhere from 5 years to a decade to get an answer from a court, to have a judge say, oh, yes, you can be here and you can stay here. You are right. You're fleeing asylum. Welcome to the United States. And during that time period, those people tend to continue their lives. They start families. They get jobs. They become Americans. But then on the back end of that, to have 10 years later a judge say to you, oh, actually, we reviewed your file. Go home, is cruel. It's cruel to those people. It's bad for the United States. And so the only way to fix that at the end of the day has always been working with Congress and changing the law to close those loopholes, but also create a lawful pathway to citizenship and allow these millions of people who want to be Americans an opportunity to become Americans. And that process is broken. And I say all of that, Tara, because it took us years to try to drill that into Donald Trump's head. And I don't think it ever entered his brain. And I mean that seriously, because he was so focused on building a wall at the border and deploying U.S. troops. And we said time and again, Mr. President, you can do all of those things, but it doesn't change the fact that someone can still come up and touch the border wall and say, I'm here to claim asylum. And then they enter into that process. If you want to fix this, you need a bipartisan bill and you need to do it with Congress. That sounded, I think, boring to him. And I think it defied his notion of what the presidency was, because he saw himself as all powerful. He said those words. That's not me. And he wanted to believe he could just fix the situation with a magic wand. And so, Donald Trump gave no effort in the first term to get a bipartisan immigration deal. He was so focused on things he could do unilaterally. And I think he wasted an enormous opportunity to solve this problem for years to come. And here we are in the second administration, and he seems totally disinterested in finding some sort of bipartisan immigration deal like Bush tried to do in the early 2000s, and instead wants to figure out what's the apex of my authorities? How can I unilaterally solve this crisis? And to him, every nail looks like it needs a hammer, and that hammer is the United States military right now.
Yeah. I mean, I spoke to your former boss, Ken Cuccinelli, back before the administration, even, I think it was back in December. And he even said to me, like, it would be impossible to deport. I think Trump at one time promised 1 million people a day or something like that. He's like, we don't even have enough jumbo jets to do that, to coordinate it all. It is just too difficult of a process. But what do you think would be like the proper way to deport?
I mean, look, the honest answer is the proper way to do this would be to go through a process, get bipartisan agreement in Congress that we need to go after criminal aliens, primarily in the United States, deport those criminal aliens, individuals who have done things like, murder, rape, etc. Prioritize those individuals, but then simultaneously create the opportunity for those folks that I mentioned, people who've been here for 5 years, 10 years, to become U.S. citizens. That's the only way we're going to get a big bipartisan deal to reform the immigration system, is to seal the border and create lawful pathways for the people who are already here. It's the humane thing. It's the right thing. And it's how, a deal is going to get made on this issue. Trump has no interest in that whatsoever and wants to cobble together the resources from inside the federal government to make this happen. So what does that mean? It's going to mean robbing from other offices, agencies, and missions, not just in DHS, but across the federal government to make this happen. And I'll take folks back in time to when Mark Esper came forward and started to talk about his experiences in the Trump administration. He noted at one point Trump wanted to put 200,000 plus troops down to the U.S. southern border. Now, I want you to think for a minute. That's a deployment, on the scale of Iraq and Afghanistan.
It's huge,
and
expensive.
And so imagine that at the same time, we're in a war with Iran, the Chinese invade Taiwan, and we've got hundreds of thousands of U.S. troops tied up on U.S. territory down at the southern border. That has real consequences for American security and global security. I think we are going to start to see things like that this year. Now, I'm not predicting a 200,000 troop deployment to the border. I won't rule it out. But ICE is about to run out of money, and they're going to have to steal that from other places in DHS, and they're probably going to steal it from accounts inside the Pentagon, accounts probably focused on other very important areas of national security. But this is the president's top priority. And so you're going to see those trade-offs have real consequences, I think, for the American people.
So I understand the idea of a legal pathway, but why is he struggling to deport these criminal, migrants? What's the problem? It seems like they really are having a hard time with this, dropping them off in the wrong countries, not going through the proper due process. Why are they struggling? I mean, you mentioned that the process is harder than it was under Obama. But,
Yeah.
but what else is it?
Well, look at it's the pressure for speed. I mean, the pressure for speed is leading people, I think, to cut corners and to make these mistakes like you saw with Abrego Garcia. And then what's worse is you have an administration that is clinically unwilling to admit mistakes. And that means they've doubled down on what appear to be clear violations of people's rights. And that's a pretty noxious cocktail for dangerous things to happen. And again, I say not just to migrants, but also potentially to U.S. citizens in general, because the presidential powers that Donald Trump is using right now on immigration are a suite of presidential powers that could be used for other purposes domestically. That sounds like a conspiracy theory. It sounds like I'm fanning the flames of worry, but I'll give you another example. There were a number of circumstances when we had national emergencies, tornadoes, hurricanes, wildfires, where the president wanted to withhold aid to people in need because they were in areas, Democratic blue states and cities where there were leaders that didn't like him, and where the feeling was mutual with Donald Trump. And he wanted to withhold that aid to punish people. My fear here is that a number of these different authorities deploying the military could be used to create leverage for reasons that have nothing to do with immigration. And one case that I think has a number of folks in the national security community watching very closely is the upcoming midterm elections, because there have been calls from the political right, the MAGA movement before, to go deploy troops to the polls, notionally to secure the polls around an election, but with a sort of wink-nod understanding that when you have guys with guns at the polls, it creates natural voter suppression. It often prevents people from the left from going to the polls. And we saw this in the last election in places like Arizona, where militia groups were going to the polls as a way to intimidate voters. And you had a number of judges come out and say this is unacceptable, and to create, I think, safe areas around the polls to push back any armed individuals that were trying to patrol them. That is a worry right now. I mean, in the days since Donald Trump has said he potentially intends wider deployments of administration forces to U.S. cities, there is a worry that some of this might be done with an eye towards placing the National Guard and potentially the Marines in some of these key political areas ahead of the 2026 election. And Tara, I would, as those words come out of my mouth, it feels like, again, wow, that sounds very conspiracy theory-ish, and come on, there's no way they're doing that. But now that's the reality of the world that we're living in.
I don't question any of this.
Yeah, and in fact, in some ways, I almost can't see how Donald Trump wouldn't want to do that because it's just so tempting to him.
And he hasn't really faced that much pushback already.
That's right.
In terms of his ability to deploy the National Guard. This was fascinating, Miles. I'd love to have you back. I feel like I've learned so much. I still can't get over the fact that you were basically told to break the law by the president with the promise to be pardoned, essentially.
Well, and that's, I think of a harbinger of things to come. So, the justice system, nonprofit groups, watchdogs, independent journalists, I think are going to be watching very closely what happens in the weeks and months ahead, because we're truly ripe at the moment for acts of corruption that could further erode the guardrails of democracy.
So I reached out to the White House Communications Director, Stephen Chung, to ask about Miles' claim that the president offered him a pardon in exchange to break these immigration laws. And this is what Stephen said, quote, "Miles Taylor is a proven liar and fraud who disgraced his country with his despicable actions. No amount of revisionist history from his warped imagination will ever clear his name from the lies he told and continues to tell. Simply, he is an attention whore looking to stay relevant." Okay, take it for what it's worth, but I wanted to get you the response from the White House. And I hope you have a great day. Thanks for watching the Tara Palmeri Show. Please like, subscribe, follow, share it with all your friends. Help me keep this going. I want to thank my producer, Eric Abinate, my booker, Jane Fusco, and my team, Sarah Carney, Luke Radel, and Abby Baker. I couldn't do it without you guys. If you like my reporting, please go to tarapalmeri.com. You can sign up for my newsletter, The Red Letter, and you can get my exclusive reporting straight to your inbox. And it's also a way to support my independent journalism by becoming a paid subscriber. I will be back again soon.